But we don't want to leave without spending just a few minutes in the scriptures. And so I want to invite you to consider the book of Matthew, chapter 2. If you'd like to look along in the Pew Bible or on your phone, you can pull it up. I probably don't need to mention to you that the story of the Nativity and the wise men, as we typically see it described in kids' books and cartoons and even pageants, is not exactly the story as we have it in the biblical account of the book of Matthew. I hope you know that. The reality is that Jesus was born into a time of political crisis, power games, violence, and confusion. That's the real story. After the primary birth narrative of Matthew 1, we find Mary and Joseph escaping for their life as their little boy, for the life of their little boy into Egypt, because King Herod is bent on killing all the little boys under a certain age, around the age of 2, in Bethlehem and the surrounding communities. From other historical accounts during that time, we know that this is very much in keeping with the character of King Herod, given that he killed his own beloved wife and many other people within his own family because he became very paranoid about his power. And even on his deathbed, in order to conjure up some weeping and mourning for his funeral, he ordered a bunch of leaders, citizen leaders in Jericho killed so that there'd be weeping and mourning for his funeral. So yes, this does ring historically accurate as it's described in Matthew chapter 2. The reality of the situation was that not long after Jesus' birth, we find that he and his parents are in a foreign land as homeless refugees. This is the actual story. So we want to read the portion that has to do with the Magi. I don't know if you recognize that they were missing in this little moment. I thought about having a little funny thing where 3 people dressed like Magi say, "Hey, wait, what about us?" But I decided not to. So we have the story as described by Matthew. Obviously, though, it's probably a little bit longer after Jesus' birth. And so this is his account. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, at the time when Herod was king, some wise and learned men came to Jerusalem from the east. "Where is the one," they asked, "who has been born the King of the Jews? We have seen his star rising in the east, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, now think King Herod that we just described, he was very disturbed, and the whole of Jerusalem was as well. He called together all the chief priests and the scribes and the people and inquired from them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they replied. "That's what it says in the prophets. You, Bethlehem, in Judah's land, are not the least of Judah's princes. From out of you will come the ruler who will shepherd Israel, my people." Then Herod called the wise men to him in secret. He found out from them precisely where the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem. "Off you go," he said, "and make a thorough search of the child. And when you find him, report him back to me so that I can come and worship him too." When they heard what the king said, they set off. There was the star, the one that had been rising in the east, going ahead of them. It went and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were beside themselves with joy and excitement. They went into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. They opened their treasure chests and gave him presents of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, so they returned to their own country by a different route. Now, this is the story of the Magi, and oddly enough, if you were born before 1987, you might remember the delightful and infamous 1987 California Raisins version of We Three Kings. You have the kings, "We three kings of Orient," they're singing kind of opera style, and then you guys know what I'm talking about? And the camels start bouncing, and "Star of Wonder, Star of Night," I love that. This is actually, it has some, because the song was based on We Three Kings, there's a mix of tradition, lore, and biblical narration. You have to kind of figure out which is which. It's part of the challenge. So, We Three Kings of Orient are, that word Orient is not really the most helpful term. It's more of a Eurocentric kind of conception that we've kind of done away with. But we do know they were coming from the east, possibly from the Persia realm, ancient Persia. It was definitely a long distance from Palestine. The point is, they were not Jewish. That's the primary point trying to be made here by Matthew. There's only two places in Matthew's gospel where on the lips of people the term the King of the Jews is used. And remember, Matthew is a Jewish writer who's writing about a possible Jewish Messiah. And only two places in his gospel he allows the individuals to use that term, King of the Jews. One are the Roman soldiers at Jesus' death and crucifixion in mockery to him to bring social shame on him. They put on a sign, King of the Jews, and put it above the cross. And the second place that Matthew recounts that this term is used for Jesus is by these wise men. Both times they are non-Jewish, Gentile people, individuals. And that is the point Matthew is trying to make here. There's a problem here because Jesus comes not as the Messiah was expected. And please understand, for the Jewish people for 400 years, there is messianic movements that are taking place. There's at least 12 would-be messiahs that come between 200 BC and 200 years after the birth of Christ. For 400 years, there's at least 12 individuals recorded that would claim to be the Messiah of the Jews. You can read about them in the Jewish historian Josephus. He describes these movements that take place. So why, 2,000 years later, do we come and worship this would-be Jewish Messiah who is just one of at least 12 people vying for that position in the Jewish world? And why also, in the most startling, maybe, news of all, in John 1, another Jewish writer says that he came to his own, and his own received him not. In other words, the Messiah, the kind of Messiah that Jesus was not the kind that most people were expecting. The way in which he came, the way in which he went about his messianic work, what he taught, what he said, the way he lived his life, and especially the way he died, did not fit the expectations of the royal leaders, the spiritual leaders, or even the regular Jewish folk in Jesus' world. Nobody expected Jesus to come in the way that he did. The expectations they had were very clear. They wanted somebody to defeat the Romans. They wanted somebody to establish a powerful Jewish monarchy again. And they wanted somebody to rebuild the temple to its past glory. And Jesus flipped all those upside down. Jesus tended to flip all the assumptions and expectations of everyone upside down. Instead of rebuilding the temple to its former glory, he pronounced judgment upon it and said it would come down within the lifetime of those who were listening to him, which it did in AD 70 when Rome crushed Jerusalem. Instead of establishing a more powerful Jewish state, he said that his kingdom was of a different kind, and he seemed to be pushing the boundaries of who would be the central players in this special kingdom. Women, children, the poor and broken, and even non-Jewish people. All of this, of course, was very confusing to the people and even his own disciples. Half the time, they were scratching their heads saying, "What is he talking about?" But most telling of all was that instead of defeating the Romans, he allowed himself to be publicly shamed, tortured, and killed by the Romans like a lamb giving himself up for the slaughter. But what, you might be asking, does this have to do with the Magi? Good question. For Matthew, the Magi introduced a really beautiful thread in the upside-down tapestry that Jesus' messianic movement was creating. Namely, all the wrong people seem to be the primary hearts that are opened to the kingship of Jesus and the coming kingdom of God. Let me say that one more time. All the wrong people are the ones whose eyes seem to be open to the reality and the beauty and the glory of Jesus. How did these Magi get there? How did they become part of this story? A couple of things helped. Number one, their worldview helped. They had a supernatural worldview. The word magi is short for magicians. And it's not like people pulling rabbits out of, hats or doing card tricks. This is an ancient idea of magicians. These are people who would look to the skies to see the portents of coming things. They were reading the signs and the stars. They were astrologers and astronomers. In this day, those two things were combined. They were wise men. They were people who tried to see how the supernatural interconnected with the normal things happening in the world. And they assumed that if things were happening in the stars, something important was happening here. Or if things were happening here, something must be telling in the stars. They kind of moved back and forth. And so these wise men from the east saw these incredible things happening in the sky, and they begin to research what is happening in the world that would make sense of what is happening in the sky. The sky is telling us a story, and that was their vocation, to study the sky. And so their worldview helped them get there, but also their curiosity. They apparently began studying old Jewish sacred writings in order to put the pieces together to understand that the sky was telling a story of something that was happening in the Palestine area, because they began to see a star that direction. Can you imagine the kind of curiosity it would take? These weren't just three dudes on camels that were really liked jazz, As much as I like the California Raisins, that wasn't what was happening. This isn't just three dudes on camels. This is a whole group of people, servants, and the stuff they travel with. These aren't kings. These are astrologers and astronomers and magicians moving toward this portent in the sky, this star that is in a specific place. And so they've studied this possibly for years to try to determine what this star, what the sky is telling them. And this takes them to Palestine, of all places. And so their curiosity gets them there, and their determination to travel long distance to get there. They leveraged all their economic resources to get to this place. And when they got there, what does the text tell us they did? It's very simple. It says that they experienced an emotional richness and depth of meaning. Here's how Matthew says it. When they saw the star, they were beside themselves with joy and excitement. Something about this reaction taps deeply into the reality of every human's predicament and experience. We all long to, in some way, find something that will give us a depth of meaning, so much so that we will break out with joy and excitement. Every human here, I don't care if you don't agree with me, every human in this building, deep inside of them, wants to tap into this joy and delight. And these wise men were willing to travel at any length and leverage all their resources to get to the point where they could find this, to them, magical, supernatural reservoir of joy. And the text says, Matthew, the Jewish writer, says, these non-Jewish people from Persia, traveling so far, found their reservoir of joy and delight when they found the star that directed them to a little baby. Something about the normalcy of Mary and Jesus, the way that Matthew describes it, it should be striking, right? It wasn't a palace. It wasn't the temple. It was the house they had found apparently after the deal in Bethlehem. They're in a house. She's sitting there with the baby. It's not grand. They don't walk in and all of a sudden, and the band plays and the lights, the light show and the fireworks. None of that. She's just sitting in there with her baby, probably feeding the baby, probably playing with his little toes. I don't know. And in walks these not the right people for this storyline, who have traveled from far away to find the great reservoir of joy that is being directed to them by the star in the sky. There's no extravagance. There's no, oh, holy night moment. It's a mom with her baby, and in walk these dudes and fall on their face in worship. Isn't that awesome? Even the gifts were not extravagant as much as they were symbolically appropriate. Notice the three things that Matthew describes they gave. Gold. Who do you give gold to in an ancient way of seeing things? Who do you give gold to? Not to peasants. Who do you give it to? Kings. You give gold to kings. Frankincense. Frankincense was something that you would give to the gods. It was a worshipful way of presenting to deity. Myrrh? What a strange one. Where do you anoint bodies with myrrh? At death. Matthew is pointing at the symbolic nature of these gifts to describe the reality of who this child is. A God king who would give himself up to death for all mankind, not only the Jewish people, but all the world. And in this little scene, you have it all encapsulated in one little scene with Mary, her baby, these non-Jewish individuals, and these gifts that symbolically tell the story of who this child is. Say, well, what's the point of all this? Matthew's point is simply this. And I'm going to quote New Testament scholar and Second Temple Judaism expert N.T. Wright. Listen to the whole story Matthew is saying. Think about what it means for Jesus to be the true King of the Jews, and then come to him by whatever route you can and with the best gifts you can find. That's Matthew's point. Here's my point. I want to encourage you during this season of Christmas to keep moving forward toward the centerpiece of the story of God's good intentions for the world. It all comes into focus, it all comes into reality in the coming of Jesus. So I want to encourage you with me to press into Jesus, to leverage whatever time and resources you have, no matter who you are or where you come from or what you've done or what you understand, and engage with this Jewish king who many witnessed his birth and ministry and death and resurrection and believe him to be the very king and ruler of the entire world. So open up your presents this Christmas, drink your eggnog, hallelujah. Sit on Santa's lap perhaps, watch George Bailey's transformation in black and white, go see the lights of 36 Cole Avenue, but in all these movements, that's Lynn's house, by the way. And in all these movements, make the primary movement of your heart and life to lean into Jesus. Just a bit. You may have no clue or no desire, but I want to encourage you just as much as you can to lean into the reservoir that is joy for the world. And if these non-Jewish people in their magic and in their stars can travel countless miles at countless expense just to lean in for a moment to the glory that is Jesus, then we can do the same with our hearts and our lives. We can just lean in to the beauty and the glory that is Jesus. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?